Hello. I hope you enjoyed that restful minutes-long break. So we're going to get started with our second graduate panel, which is Reimagining Features from the SF Archive. So we have our wonderful panelists here who I will introduce, and I will step back so you can see them. Yeah, so we're going to present in this order, going from right to left. So don't make fun of me. I have messed up my directions in front of audiences. So Lucas Norling is a graduate student of English at California State University, Fullerton. Their research explores literary encounters and entanglements between human and non-human life with the aim of envisioning alternative modes of interphilosophical relationality. Then we have Jay Johnson, is a PhD student in English at the University of California, Riverside. Their research interests include race, gender, and sexuality, specifically Black queerness and gender nonconformity. Currently, the research looks at Black queer cultural production and the representation of Black queer identities across different media. And then lastly, we have Arthur Maturo studied children's picture book theory with Dr. Jackie Salka and comics graphic novels with Dr. Charles Patfield and C.S. Northridge. As a PhD student in the English department at Eastern Riverside, under the guidance of Dr. Andre Carrington, he explored a number of 70s and 80s manga magazines housed in the Eaton archive, many of which have never been translated into English. He is currently researching Altohiro Otomo's Akira, as well as John Ostrander and Timothy Truman's Grimjack. His future research interests will focus on illustrated bodies in comics and graphic novels that undermine hegemonic narratives. So, welcome to our lovely panelists. And we will get started.
Okay. Hello, I'm Lucas. This is my MA thesis. Please enjoy. I'm here to talk to you today about Ursula K. Le Guin's wonderful 1974 novel, The Dispossessed. This is a very influential piece of utopian science fiction. It's one of very few books to have won the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus Awards. This is a story that takes place on two neighboring worlds that sort of orbit one another like moons. One world is called Urus. It is home to a capitalist society and a socialist society that are sort of vying for power, very much 1974. And then the other world is called Inaris. It's home to an anarchist colony. It is ostensibly anti-hierarchical, although there are troubles there as well. Urus is a biologically diverse planet. Lots of different plants and animals and ecologies, whereas Inaris is relatively arid, very few natural species. The story is about the protagonist Shevik, who is a theoretical physicist. He travels from Inaris to Urus to publish a radical new temporal theory that has sort of been suppressed on Inaris based on petty academic egos, if anyone's familiar with that. Ultimately, he finds that Urus is not the paradise that it paints itself to be, and he joins the workers of the capitalist society in a general strike that ends in violent suppression. The central plot is not really the focus of my essay, and I will not bother you here with it anymore. What I'm really curious about is this subtitle, An Ambiguous Utopia. There's been a lot of discussion about what this means. What does this refer to? The ambiguity is itself ambiguous. That's kind of fun. A lot of people will point to Inaris, the anarchist colony, this egalitarian society, and they will say, this is the ambiguous utopia. And they'll say it's ambiguous in that it is flawed. Others will say it's contingent upon personal and cultural values. utopias. So folks on the anarchist world might say that they live in a utopia. Folks in the capitalist society on the other world might say they live in a utopia. So they might look at the other planet and say that's a utopia. So ambiguous in that way, right? And still others will say that it's ambiguous in that utopia is only found in the process, the perpetual process of striving for a utopian society, this constant deconstruction and reconstruction of society. But where do I locate utopia in the story? I'm glad I pretended you asked. I locate utopia in the gaze of an otter. There's a moment about halfway through the book where Shevik meets his co-worker's child's pet otter, and they have a moment. Eaton was allowed to bring in his pet, a half-grown land otter, a common animal on Earth. It was the first uncaged animal Shevik had seen up close, and it was more fearless of him than he was of it. The otter sat up on its haunches and looked at him. His eyes were dark, shot with gold, intelligent, curious, innocent. Amar, Shevik whispered, caught by that gaze across the gulf of being. Brother. So this is obviously a very impactful moment for Shevik. He's having an encounter that is notable here. Even as this is sort of a moment that's easily passed over in the book because it's kind of happening off to the side. So there's no animals really on Earth, like I said, or on Mars rather. It's a relatively barren world. There's just like fish and worms and stuff. Why is he so moved by seeing this animal that he's never encountered before? And why does he use the term brother, which holds a lot of significance in his culture? It refers essentially to, an equal, a fellow, member of his community, essentially. So why would he call this otter by this name? And in particular, what does this term caught by that gaze across the gulf of being? What does this mean? Well, for some of us, this might bring to mind Derrida's work in The Animal That Therefore I Am. Specifically, there's a moment in which he describes standing naked before his cat. He says, when the cat responds in its name, it doesn't do so as an exemplar of a species called cat, even less so of an animal, genus, or kingdom. It comes to me as this irreplaceable living being that one day enters my space into this place where it can encounter me. So importantly, for Derrida, the point that he's trying to make here is that the cat that stands before him is not fungible. It is not merely cat. It is a singular, unique presence, much like his own. He is a unique, singular presence standing before another unique presence that cannot be reduced to mere symbolic categories. And importantly, this is an ethically charged encounter, both Shevik's and Derrida's encounter here. Animal studies scholar Matthew Kalarka writes that the face of the other cannot be delimited a priori to the realm of the human. Animals might call upon and obligate me in ways that I cannot fully anticipate. So again, there's this moment of standing before another being and being called to care or protect the life that is in front of you. Importantly, this happens as a subversion of the symbolic order, the human-animal binary. Again, Derrida later on in the same work writes that animal is a word that men have given themselves the right to give. They have given themselves the word in order to corral a large number of living beings within a single concept, the animal. So again, there is a subversion here of the sense that there is I, human, and that other thing that is merely animal. Instead, there are these singular presences standing before one another. And this is where it's important that Shevik is coming from a planet where there are no animals like this. He does not have the pre-existing framework to reduce this being to merely animal. Instead, he recognizes it in all of its singularity. But what does this have to do with utopia? I hear everyone wondering. Utopia, in its as it was originally coined, is a pun. It sounds like utopia, utopia, meaning good place, but it's spelled utopia, as in no place. And so, while we might assume that this refers to a place that does not exist or cannot exist, it's a good place that can only be experienced in the imagination or on the page. I wonder what happens when we reconceive of that term. What I would suggest is that during this moment of encounter with the other, or the otter in this case, a response is demanded. But the nature of this response is not predetermined. Attention is exerted by the simultaneous existence of many possible responses. So again, standing before the other, there is an ethical obligation that is made by this other presence, but the nature of the response that's demanded of you is unclear. There are many different degrees or types of responses that can be given of variously ethical qualities. And so this is what I propose. The seeds of a good place exist in this pre-responsive no place. The potential of myriad ethical relationalities generated in this moment is felt as a dissonance. So hence this term I'm coining utopic dissonance. It's the sense of standing before the other, and there are utopic possibilities that exist sort of in this moment of encounter. And it's those possibilities that are, fully utopic. So what this suggests is that utopia exists pre-politically in an ethical space. Utopia would then only be realized imperfectly in the political realm as an outgrowth of this ethical relationality. It does not and cannot exist as a fully realized place or system, but political actions that stem directly from ethical encounters bear a trace of utopia. And so this is sort of emphasized further as I read it in the most overt political action that Shevik takes in the novel. He speaks again, he speaks at this general strike for workers. And he says, "It is our suffering that brings us together. The bond that binds us is beyond choice. We are brothers. We are brothers in what we share. In pain, in hunger, in poverty, in hope, we know our brotherhood. You cannot buy the revolution. You cannot make the revolution. You can only be the revolution. It is in your spirit or it is nowhere." Excuse me. So when Shevik calls the otter brother, this is what I think he means. He is suggesting that utopia is found in the imminent interdependence of all life and the ethical obligations that arise therein. To be utopian, then, is to act utopic, to do one's best to reify the utopic potential uncovered in moments of encounter. So this is my sort of central disciplinary intervention, right? I'm taking animal studies, I'm taking utopian studies, and I'm kind of making them kiss. The idea here is that looking at utopia in this way allows us to engage with utopian imaginaries in which all life, human, non-human, is necessarily included in the moment of utopic encounter. Again, sort of trying to challenge anthropocentric notions of what a utopia might be. So as I sort of wrap up here, do me a favor, just turn to the person next to you, stare him in the eyeballs, feel the discomfort of this, the tension. There's another living being that's right in front of you.
It's not personal.
Feel that strangeness.
What?
Utopias in it.
There we go.
That's all I got.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jay. I want to preface saying that this is a small part of a larger argument. Uh, and so today I'll be discussing Renaissance of film by Beyonce and how it uses Black archival practices, such as excavation and storytelling to create a queer Afrofuturist utopia. But before I do that, I want to give some context with a real world example. With a real world example about the ongoing struggles of Black queer people in the United States. On July 29, 2023, O'Shea Sibley was at a gas station with friends, listening to Beyonce's Renaissance album while he was fueling his car. Moved by the music, Sibley began to vogue, a distinctly queer dance found in the ballroom community, which is in itself a sub-community of Black and Latina queer people who wanted to move away from the racism of the white queer community. So as he was voguing, a 17-year-old began to say homophobic slurs to him, and an altercation ensued, and he was stabbed and unfortunately passed away. This hate crime was big in the New York City Black queer and ballroom communities. They came together for a visual with signs saying Black queer lives matter and Vogue as an act of resistance. Beyonce also paid tribute to O'Shea Sibley on her Renaissance website, where she said, rest in power, O'Shea Sibley. Beyonce's gesture, though it seems small, is indicative of her work in her Renaissance album, or project. And by project, I mean the artwork, the album, and the film. Like those in those communities affected by Sibley, she preserves his legacy, showcasing the resilient, resistant, celebratory nature of Black queer culture. Her project aims to create a future where Black queer identities are not only included but celebrated. In light of events like this, it becomes very imperative to think about the cultural significance of finding an art or a piece of Beyonce in our archive. So a little bit about the film. Renaissance is a documentary style concert film that explores Beyonce's making of the tour, but also a biography of those people inside, or those people from the ballroom community and how they have come to change the face of popular music through vibrant storytelling using autobiography, or not autobiography, but biography, interviews, and the inclusion of these ballroom dancers on the stage. Beyonce begins to start to add this subculture to our archive, and I'll get to how in a second. At its core, Renaissance embodies the visionary ethos of Afrofuturism, blending elements of science fiction, fantasy, and African diasporic traditions to craft speculative futures. Through visual imagery, intricate choreography, and evocative storytelling, Beyonce invites audiences on a journey through time and space, challenging conventional narratives and envisioning new possibilities for collective liberation. Central to the film is its engagement with queer spatiality. And here I'm talking about queer spatiality in terms of Jose Esteban Munoz. Renaissance celebrates the fluidity of identity, the resilience of marginalized communities, and the transformative potential of embracing alternative modes of existence. as a cultural artifact, as you've seen, or as I've just told you, Beyonce's album and project spans beyond just what we see on the screen, but out into cultural discourse. The way that I'm thinking about Beyonce is Renaissance film by Beyonce utilizes Afrofuturist aesthetics to construct a queer spatial utopia, emphasizing Vogue and raw culture and engaging in knowledge production informed by Black archival practices. Through excavation and storytelling, the film contributes to the preservation and celebration of Black work histories, while also envisioning inclusive and transformative futures. So in Renaissance, a film by Beyonce, we see a clear use of Black archival practices, specifically through excavation and storytelling. According to Amaka Okechukwu in a special issue of Black archival practices, she defines Black archival practice as a relationship to evidence that recognizes Black humanity and complexity. It is concerned with history, memory, and community vitality. The practice is a subset of memory work in a broad range of practices that preserve, resurrect, frame, and contest the past. Excavation, as Okechukwu describes, involves intentional, concerted attempts to excavate for historical evidence and recover these artifacts for our collective benefit. This type of memory work is important for both professional archivists and community members who work to preserve their histories. In Renaissance, Beyonce uncovers certain histories of the ballroom scene, highlighting the experiences and contributions of Black queer individuals who have been key to this culture. Storytelling is another important part of Black archival practice, characterized by the intergenerational transfer of knowledge. The film uses storytelling by featuring biographies and interviews with key figures from the ballroom scene. Through these personal narratives, the film documents the community's struggles and successes. And so this blurry image that I have there is actually a part of the film. It is a piece of archival, a piece of an archive from Kevin Jay-Z Prodigy, who is known as the voice of ballroom, and it is in the actual movie. And so I'm saying that it is these types of excavation and storytelling that Beyonce brings to the forefront to help us understand and change ideas of the future, about a queer future. Afrofuturism and utopian imaginings. So here is where my idea of Afrofuturist, an Afrofuturist utopia comes into play. It is combining Jose Esteban Munoz's idea of queerness and queer utopias and cruising utopia, and also Isaiah Lavender's idea of Afrofuturism being a utopia by of itself. Jose Munoz's concept of queerness extends beyond sexual orientation. He describes it as a performative because it is not simply a being, but a doing for and toward the future. One that is a structuring and educated mode of desiring that allows us to see and feel beyond the quagmire of the present. Munoz envisions queer utopia as a space where marginalized identities are celebrated and oppressive systems are dismantled, always oriented towards a hopeful future. So there's like this idea of hope that a lot of us have been talking about throughout these panels. Likewise, Isaiah Lavender finds Afrofuturism to be a utopia of itself. He describes Afrofuturism as a form of world building that imagines Black existence in new ways, in new worlds where race and racism can be reimagined or transcended. Lavender states Afrofuturism must be considered utopian to some degree because it seeks to perform world building on a scale that imagines Black being in new ways. And the reason I'm putting these together is because in Lavender's idea of Afrofuturism being a utopia, I didn't see any kind of queer identity there. And even though here I'm talking about queerness as future oriented, I am also still talking about queerness as a sexual orientation as well. By integrating Munoz and Lavender's concepts, the film constructs a queer Afrofuturist utopia. It uses archival practices of excavation and storytelling to uncover the rich histories of ballroom scene. The dual focus on the past and future not only preserves the cultural heritage of Black queer communities, but also inspires, imagines inclusive, transformative futures. And so this is what I'm calling a queer spatial utopia. In the sense that the concert space is a utopia for the concert goers. I was going to say club goers. The concert goers, and while watching the film, it becomes you enter into also into a utopic space. And on the screen is imagination is more important than knowledge, and part of Afrofuturism is this idea about imagination. Black archival practices are also look towards different tactics than what Western traditional archives allow us to hear Black voices. Hear Black voices in the archive. And so Beyonce creates this world where everyone is free and celebrated. At one point in the film, she says, we are pretty much creating our own world. And she literally does. These stages, this is one of 3, and it takes a lot of people to create this stage. This screen, though it seems like it's one, it is actually many screens put together. And as she's performing on this stage, there are 2 other stages in other cities getting built at the same time. So she is literally making a world that is sort of cyclical and on itself, going on itself, right? It's always this promise of continuation, even though the concert has ended for tonight. You can go to the next city over and, not let anyone break your soul. She also says that her ultimate goal is to create a space where everyone is free and no one is judged. They can all be on that stage. They are the visions. They are the new beginning. That's what the Renaissance is about. So in this space, even though when she says they, it is a collective they that you can see a collective they through the dancers, right? You can be in this dance floor and you can still be on the stage. And so I also want to pay attention to who she's indexing. Here we have Jonte Moaning and Aquila Cornelius. Jonte Moaning is prominent in the ballroom community, but they have also been a part of Beyonce's backup dance. And Kevin Aviance, who is really big in the ballroom community and has been written about extensively when we talk about ballroom. Kevin Aviance said, "The hold is up, and for Beyonce to see us, and by us, Kevin Aviance is saying these identities, these Black queer identities, for Beyonce to see us and say, these kids have fab stories to tell. She owned it, she digested it, she became part of us, and that's so over because we are a part of her." And so I think Aviance really talks about or gets at this nature of back and forth that queer utopia allows for us to start to not take up people's experiences, but to understand them and to be a part of them, or be a part of the individual in a collective way, rather than in other societies where homophobia and racism abound. So lastly, I just want to, this is the artifact from the Eaton that brought me down this road. To me, it's clear that the film serves as a multifaceted celebration of and documentation of marginalized identities within the ballroom scene. Throughout our discussion, we see how Beyonce's vision of creating a space where everyone is free and celebrated resonates deeply with the principles of queerness and Afrofuturism. Moreover, the archival object that I'm showing you now serves as a tangible reminder of the importance of preserving cultural heritage and fostering inclusivity within archival spaces. This poster not only represents a specific moment in time, but also embodies the stories and experiences of those within the ballroom community. As we move forward, it's essential to continue engaging with archival objects and practices to ensure the preservation and celebration of diverse voices and experiences. Renaissance reminds us of the power of storytelling and the importance of creating spaces where everyone's story can be heard and played. Thank you.
Okay, so this also is something of a piece of a larger work that is in the process of being developed, and will likely become two different objects. This is what it appears to be. For the moment, I'm attempting to work with a number of different manga that are published in a 5-year period, and see how they're running on parallel tracks or perhaps even the same tracks. So, yeah. Before we actually begin, however, we need to present some care warnings. This presentation contains images and topics that cover nudity, sex, drug use, violence, blood, horror, sexual assault with the intention to rape, and a number of other possibly triggering, disturbing motifs or themes, as well as reflections of a turbulent time in Japanese modern history, all of which are common in manga, particularly in manga from 1970 till 1990. Manga spaces tend to be extremely open to whatever, anything and everything that one wants to depict. So definitely don't want to spring this on everyone, but please exercise care in the way that you need. Okay. Katsuhiro Otomo's groundbreaking 1982 to 1990 manga series Akira reflects a number of public anxieties that permeated social spaces during the 1970s and 80s across Japan. Both the manga and the anime are replete with images that carry multiple very rich layers of meaning. Reflections of sociocultural anxieties and political violence in response to geopolitical events, many of which remain relevant to contemporary Japan, were embedded within highly nuanced layers of meaning, narrated through illustrations. Many of these layers of meanings, however, continue to evade Western audiences because the cultural knowledge necessary to peel back such layers of meaning tend to resist translation when conveyed through images or illustrations. For this discussion, I will focus on reflections of social anxiety depicted in the original manga illustrations. Japan's sudden shift from the modern to the postmodern from about 1970 to 1980 resulted in the emergence of a variety of countercultures that continue to resonate in contemporary Japanese social cultural spheres. Motoko Tanaka, in her 2014 book, Apocalypse in Contemporary Japanese Fiction, situates her discussion of Japanese apocalyptic fiction produced during the 70s and 80s within the philosophical and sociological work of Japanese scholars who observed a major shift in Japanese culture leading into the 1980s. Connecting sociologist Masashi Osawa's theory with philosopher Hiroki Azuma's theories and art critic Noe Sawaragi's arguments, which concur that 1970 was the year in which there was a major cultural change in Japan from modern to postmodern. Tanaka goes on to summarize a number of cultural developments that precipitate the shift. He argues that while post-modernity gradually spreads among Western countries, in the 1960s, it begins to influence Japanese culture from 1970. The terms postmodern and postmodernity are often used to designate cultural trends since the 1960s or 70s, when many cultural genres were transformed. The rise of rock music, film special effects, pop art, hallucinogenic drugs like LSD, the personal computer, the decline of politics and literature, and the death of the avant-garde symbolize the decisive discontinuity of our contemporary cultural situation. Tanaka's list of cultural shifts is by no means exhaustive, as later in the section she points toward additional economic factors which exerted significant pressure on broader Japanese culture, resulting in consequential changes to social practices, many of which remain indelibly marked on the social memory, and which are preserved in manga produced during the 1970s and 80s, Otomo's Akira not the least among them. Well, motorcycle gangs, or Gosozoku in Japanese, emerged in the 1950s. It was during the 1970s and 80s that they impacted Japanese society the most. Membership in Bosozoku clubs swelled from 1973 and peaked in 1983, their numbers alone becoming a reason for moral panic. Simultaneously, Japan experienced an increase in juvenile delinquency from 1970 to 1983, often cited as Japan's third wave of post-war juvenile delinquency. As Bosozoku counterculture, often marked by street violence, and juvenile delinquency become increasingly visible in shared public spaces across Japan, images and representations of Bosozoku and delinquent behavior begin to appear in popular manga. The illustration of Otomo's groundbreaking post-apocalyptic cyberpunk manga Akira amalgamates Bosozoku and juvenile delinquency, mirroring authentic happenings in Japan. These youth subcultures collectively represented a symbolic rebellion against the establishment. In the case of Japan, against the post-war bureaucratic, institutionalized carceral society with its biopolitics, disciplining citizens through modern institutions. Otomo's Akira celebrates such rebellious groups by featuring biker gang protagonists who are obsessed with speed and violence, as if their youthful energy will unsettle and renew institutionalized life, or even demolish the rigid social and political structure of 1980s Japan. While the creative choice to position Bosozoku members as anti-hero protagonists in Otomo's narrative may appear intuitive, it reveals both a public awareness of and social anxiety around the violent behavior that many Bosozoku members practice. By placing Akira into conversation with additional manga that center Bosozoku characters within speculative narratives, I aim to show how manga produced in the late 70s and early 80s reflect both public anxiety over the increasing presence of Bosozoku activity in social spaces, as well as accurate depictions of Bosozoku gang violence. 3 manga titles located in the J. Lloyd Eaton collection that can be placed into conversation with Akira include Go Nagai's Violence Jack, Kaze Shinobu's Violence Rider, Cycle no Bosozoku, or Violence Rider, The Last Bosozoku, and Shotaro Ishimori's Genma Taisen. Ishimori's Genma Taisen and Shinobu's Violence Rider, like Akira, position Bosozoku protagonists in their respective narratives. Nagai's Violence Jack, by contrast, positions a number of Bosozoku characters as violent sociopaths, highlighting the social anxiety of the time. Despite the contrast between Bosozoku as antagonist or protagonist, the common motifs that thread through all 4 manga, mirroring the deviant Bosozoku lifestyle, include disrupting public spaces, getting into trouble with police, and committing extremely violent acts. Street gang warfare. The introductory chapter to his 1991 book, Kamikaze Biker, Ikuya Sato describes his experience of studying Bosozoku activities that were typical in the 1970s and 80s. On weekend nights in the summer, the most popular and congested streets in Japanese metropolises explode with sounds that startle and deafen pedestrians. Souped up motorbikes roar down the streets at speeds twice those posted, and 3 times those most Japanese drivers manage in Japan's urban congestion. Young, well-groomed, and carefully dressed, they live for boso, high speed and high risk driving on city streets. That is why the Japanese public gave them the name Boso Zoku, the tribe, Zoku, of those who devote themselves to unlawful and often fatal racing. They prowl the streets in groups and seek action, including occasional gang fights. These descriptions all but book match illustrations of Boso Zoku throughout Otomo's Akira. Volume 1 in particular features extended gang fights spread across multiple pages, demanding that we view motorcycle gangs racing, prowling the streets, seeking out action, and getting into fights. The image we see depicts Boso Zoku running wild through the urban streets, riding dangerously on modified motorcycles. This particular one is from Akira, depicts the capsules, the central protagonists of this manga, as they ride through the streets of Neo-Tokyo. Otomo illustrates them disrupting and engaging the public and shared social space, racing their motorcycles, causing ear-splitting noise as one of the female characters crossing the street attempts to cover her ears, performing stunts or tricks, and recklessly misbehaving. Additionally, these images from a 2-page spread highlighting brief moments of the gang fight that ensues between the capsules and a rival gang, the clowns, show some of the details of what typical Boso Zoku gang fight would look like. Typically using clubs, pipes, or sticks, attacking each other while racing down the street. Both reflecting Sato's descriptions of typical Boso Zoku activity. So moving into the manga that I'm placing in the conversation, Go Nagai's post-apocalyptic series, Violence Jack, evinces extreme public anxiety and fear centered around Boso Zoku activities, as according to Sato, they were sensationalized through increased media production. In 1975, there was a spike in the number of articles about Boso Zoku. This number decreased over the next few years, but news outlets continued to generate provocative content. When Violence Jack is published in 1977, Nagai's depictions of a Tokyo that experiences complete and total breakdown of law and order emerges on the heels of the initial media excitement over Boso Zoku deviance. It's not surprising, therefore, that the Boso Zoku antagonists are violent sociopaths who disrupt public space, who drink excessively, engage in acts of violence, and sexually assault female characters with the intent to rape. Much of Nagai's depictions of Boso Zoku, however, do not reflect typical Boso Zoku activities. While they were violent, they usually exercised violence against rival gang members, or in fights with police, rarely against civilians. Moreover, Boso Zoku members have gone on record claiming that ordinary females, quote unquote, were not sexually exploited because they report rapes to authorities. Rather, they would target females already involved in deviant lifestyles. An admission that does not exculpate them. That's right, never excusable. Depictions of aggressive violence perpetrated against civilians appears to reflect the excessive social panic and extreme anxiety of the time, whipped up by news stories sensationalized by various media outlets. Moving on, Kaze Shinobu's Violence Writer is set in a dystopian future where an authoritarian government uses the general population as guinea pigs for scientific experimentation. Angel Saki is the last Boso Zoku, a deviant youth who refuses to adhere to government or social authority. Figures on a desolate highway, reminiscent of George Miller's film, The Road Warrior. she's spotted by police a police figure who is told to kill her on sight. Two additional members of the police force are dispatched to ensure that she is neutralized. A grisly confrontation ensues when one of the police officers attempts to detain her. As Angel violently fights back against police authority, her foot is severed above the ankle. Lost my place. She awakens from a brief blackout and drags herself across the highway to retrieve her severed foot, a representation of the characteristic toughness Bosozoku members often performed. Didn't work out, but that's okay. There it is. Having been a government test subject, she has developed superhuman abilities and is able to use psychic powers to reattach her foot. She then executes the remaining police officer. In both Akira and Violence Writer, rejection of and confrontation with authorities reflect the culture of Bosozoku. Though a dark anti-heroine, Angel is the protagonist that Shinobu centers the readers to follow throughout the series. Shotaro Ishimori's Genma Taisen depicts Bosozoku activity with the least amount of violence among the four manga placed in the conversation. It does, however, accurately depict Bosozoku riding through the city, causing disruptions and evading police. Interestingly, Akira, Violence Writer, and Genma Taisen all feature Bosozoku characters as anti-hero protagonists, and all three feature anti-hero protagonists confronting police authority. Ishimori portrays a highway under skyscraper at night in urban Tokyo, 1980. Lights of the building, background, the lights of the highway and the lights of the vehicles are on the highway are highlighted in much the same way that Otomo illuminates much of post-apocalyptic Neo-Tokyo. Traffic accidents occur as police chase a group of Bosozoku through the city. The Bosozoku characters evade police, riding recklessly, jumping over other members of the gang. They eventually lose the police, and similar to Akira, ends with a two-page spread of Tokyo at night. One panel in which Ishimori arranges the objects of a police chase anticipates a panel of volume 1 of Akira. A police interceptor and Bosozoku move from the back of the panel outward toward the reader, rather than from right to left, which is the typical direction for forward movement in manga. The police interceptor is positioned farther back in the panel behind the motorcycles of the Bosozoku. Otomo uses a similar arrangement of objects and implies a similar direction of momentum. Let's do our demonstrations. Go Nagai's Violence Jack, Kaze Shinobu's Violence Writer, Shotaro Ishimori's Genma Taisen, and Katsuhiro Otomo's Akira all reflect the fears and anxiety of 1970s and 1980s Japan, centered around juvenile delinquency and the violence of Bosozoku gangs. Whether hyped up by the media or well-founded in factual studies, Bosozoku activity permeated social spaces, remains imprinted upon social memory. But ubiquitous and immediate were the impressions of danger at the time, that reflections of social panic were captured in the manga of the late 70s and early 80s. It's important to place these texts in the conversation to reveal what the cultures that produced them were concerned with at the time of their production. And it is equally important that these artifacts be curated and preserved in archives such as the J. Lloyd Eaton collection, as many continue to dismiss comics and manga as childish or as a fetish or otaku, even though such texts preserve important historical and cultural records. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you to all our presenters. So we're going to move into a little Q&A. If there are any questions online, feel free to drop them in the chat, or if anyone in the audience has questions to ask.
My question's for Jay.
So I actually attended the Renaissance tour and I also saw the film. So there's a moment within the tour film where she has the voiceover of Neil, Harris Garrison, the actual Black astrophysicist, where he actually talks about time. And it's actually visually, we see it as like a black hole. So what do we make of that as part of your conversation about this queer Afrofuturity? Alongside that, I was interested about her use of samples within the music itself, and we can even think about it as through the film and what that does in preserving and archiving queer subjectivity. And finally, what also do you make of actually her allowing for a ballroom scene to actually be enacted on stage and then be preserved in the film?
You don't mind if I take this off? It feels. Okay. So what I heard was, what do we do with this idea of time that Beyonce shows through going through a black hole? Also, what do we do with sampling in the music and
Potentially the visual as well.
the visual as well? And then the third one was about enacting a ball on stage. Great questions. So a lot of I'm getting into media and cultural studies. So a lot of what I wanted to do was like show you, because Vogue is also about movement. So it's hard to say, here's a still, you get a grainy archival picture. But with the going through a black hole, she also on her Twitter put a picture of what happens, and we are going from our universe into alternative universe. So in that moment, as we're learning about time and going through the black hole, we are now starting to think about this alternative space, and that is created via like the walls of the concert. It's one that celebrates Black queer bodies because of the ball that you see. I've been thinking about that for a while. It's in the Motherboard Act, I believe. I might be wrong. But it's also in yes, your Beyonce studies. But it's also one of those, it's in a moment where Beyonce is also not on stage. So in this moment where people should be kind of in a lull of a concert, they are celebrating as these ballroom dancers are walking categories, as Kevin Jay-Z Prodigy is calling the category out, right? The body is sex siren, and someone comes and they do their dance. The body, the category is feminine and cunt, right? And you have this queer, not assigned male at birth body in heels and still feeling like cunt. Skirt, his name is Darius Hickman. I always get him mixed up with Deshaun from Legendary. You have Darius Hickman, who still has these like, who does this, I don't even want to say gender bending, because like that still feels wrong, right? Who expresses gender in multiple types of ways. And then the third one is, what do we do with sampling? It's heavily sampled. And I think that is part of the archival work that she's doing, right? She's escalating these sonic spaces for people who have helped house music or fall music or whatever you want to call it, because it has a few names depending on who you talk to, but who has influenced that sound that we are in this like cultural moment obsessed with, right? Part of her project is, I think, a turn back to 1980s and 1990s ball culture like Pose, like Legendary, and Beyonce is doing it
Mhm.
in a musical album. Does that answer your question? Or questions? Thank you.
Nice. I believe we have a question from online.
We have a question from Jay, question from Cheryl. Cheryl asks, my question is to ask for any comments you might have about how ballroom shows up in Beyonce's film versus how it shows up in Pose, the TV series. I'm interested in both of these being important sites of identification and cultural education, but also both implicated into the political autonomy of media systems, parentheses, in distinct ways. Are there ways that a music concert and related film has more autonomy from industry questions than a television series, or is it just different kinds of constraints?
That is a great question, Cheryl. Give me 1 second to formulate an answer. So the difference between Pose, or what we see in Pose and what we see Beyonce doing, I'm not sure if I want to say that they're distinct. I think that with queer showrunners, it comes from this space where we're actually trying to learn about these experiences of people in ball community in the 1980s and 1990s. And I think the voguing that shows up there is situated in this time. It's called voguing the old way. It's more about lines, but the voguing that we see in Renaissance is you actually see both. You see voguing the old way in this like fluid, fluid feminine form that we have in contemporary ball culture. Can you read the second part of that question? It's a Cheryl question, so it's a lot there.
Yeah.
Give me 1 second, Cheryl.
I think there's a couple of parts, but the last two sentences is, are there ways that a music concert and related film has more autonomy from industry questions than a television series, or is it just different kinds of constraints?
I will have to think about that particular part of like, what are the distinctions? What are the constraints? And if how they overlap and diverge. I'm not sure if I can say yes or no that they're distinct in this type of way. Thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you, Jay. Sorry, I'm not on camera. I'm not fit for camera today, but great presentation. We'll talk more.
Thank you, for sure.
Yeah, sorry, I need to stand up to see. Let's start in the back here and then move up front.
So I kind of have like I can't see both of you at the same time, but I have a shared question for sort of Lucas and Jay. I'm curious, you both seem to be sort of locating utopia as something that can be performed rather than spatially. I think is a way that like it often gets represented in media. We think of like places as utopia, but literally the joke of it being no place. Shevik performs utopia in a sense in the gaze of the audience. And then similarly, like the idea of the performance is what really makes the space utopic. I'm just interested in hearing, Paula, if that is something that like you thought about as you were working on your different projects. Like there are very different projects as I do this. But there seems to be something similar in that location. I'm just interested in that dialogue. Like, what do you guys think that is?
Yeah, so I think that I go off into weird metaphysical land, and so I think what I'm trying to say is that utopia only exists in this sort of realm of potential. In that it is in, I don't know if I would describe it in terms of performance, but it's in action that utopia is partially reified. And so I don't, yeah, I do think that spatiality is something I'm trying to move away from. And I don't know that, again, I don't know that I would go toward performance as the description of that. But I'll have to think on that some more. It was an interesting way of framing it.
So yeah, I'm definitely like utopia as future oriented as well, something that we're always striving for. And it's something that the moment you think you have it, you don't. Something's going to move it forward. And so I am thinking about utopia in this sense of like, I think at the moment in the sense of space. But I'm interested in not just how performances create like spatial utopias, but do other things with utopias, and it will be interesting to like get some suggestions from anyone who knows anything about that. But I want to not move, but I want to think about utopia in like multiple types of ways. And I was thinking about the utopic or utopias when I was thinking about the concert space. The reason I was thinking about it was because I was reading Jafari S. Allen's There's a Disco Ball Between Us, and how the dance floor is a site of futurity, and that really, my ADHD brain takes me everywhere, which is fun because like then you start to make these connections that you probably wouldn't have gotten, before. So that's how I love Munoz. So I've been like dealing with him for a while. But this was the first time where I'm really dealing with utopia as like a spatial place.
It seems like you have multiple layers going on, right? Because there is a utopia in a spatial sense that's coexisting with this idea of utopia as a futurity. And it's this almost like partial manifestation of the future in the present in a limited space that's sort of ephemeral, right? Because it's gonna disappear once they take down the stage and stuff like that. Yeah. There's like interesting tensions there that I think are really cool.
Yeah, sorry, let's address.
There's a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, you want to address
No, we can go here first and then Zoom and then bounce back to the audience. We're kind of queuing up questions.
My question is for Arthur. I was wondering if you had thought about, I'm thinking about like delinquency. You're discussing it in Bosozoku, and there's kind of a tradition carried forward, and like, you mentioned. Sorry, there's a different assigned question coming up to get to that. But the way that you're describing delinquency, it really the potential for delinquency to produce like an anti. Like I'm interested in the capacity for it to create like an anti-colonial aesthetic, but it also the way that it might be folded in to like nationalism as well, just because like the continuing trend of delinquents in manga becoming less so about, as far as as far as I've read, there's definitely this in the 70s and 80s where you're talking about this like delinquency in terms of social, definitely like anti-national, anti-colonial social destruction is part of it. But then you see things like in delinquents like Naruto, delinquents like you say Urameshi and Yu Yu Hakusho. You see a lot of these delinquents who are powered by good. That we want, we're just misunderstood. We can be reformulated as a colonial or national subject to like continue forward, save the village, protect the group identity and stuff. And I'm wondering how you like think about delinquency in modern manga as potentially fighting against that colonial or national reformation, especially with like new stuff like Jujutsu Kaisen, Yuji Itadori, like the new delinquent kind of who wants to be surrounded by people you love but is also destroying things.
Yeah. The anti-colonial pro-nationalism motif that is often practiced by delinquents is very active, starting at least in the 1980s. And it has continued forward. Akira in the manga, there is in volumes 5 and really developed in volume 6, this strong anti-colonial sentiment where our central character, the leader of the Bosozoku gang capsules, Haneno, after the large events when Tetsuo and Akira formed during the explosion of light and then merged together and the destruction of Neo Tokyo for the third time is complete, he returns to what's left of Neo Tokyo. At the same time, the UN is coming in with a large number of what are military forces, and this delinquent, who is both a drug user and a drug seller in the book, essentially stands up and tells them, get out. We don't want you here anymore. You're not allowed here. Yeah. They respond by saying, but we have these foodstuffs and, humanitarian aid. And he says, that's fine. You can leave it on the shore. Not allowed here anymore. In this world, they call it the Great Tokyo Empire. He says, this is the Great Tokyo Empire. This is not your space any longer. Yeah, they unfurl this huge banner that says the Great Tokyo Empire. They were dogs. And that's in Akira, which that actually finishes in 1990. But Otomo was already thinking about that in 1982. It also seems interesting to me that we can see a lot of anti-colonial sentiment going on in manga today, like One Piece. Yeah. Where as they travel to these islands, some of the confrontations or the fights that they have to overcome have to do with removing a colonial oppressor and returning the dispossessed island to the people who were first there. And this is routine in One Piece. And so this is a sentiment that has been pretty steady for quite a long time. And this actually extends farther back to the 1960s to the failed student protests, the Onpo protests, where 30 million protesters out of a population of about 93 million, so it's 1/3 of the country, is actively protesting against the Japan-US treaty, which actually makes it legal for the US to occupy and by keeping permanent military bases in their soil. So 30 million people actively protested against it. And so a lot of this anti-colonialism that we see in manga is really extended back to the 1960s when this was being heavily protested.
I'm interested in like national, like how does that anti-colonialism develop like a nationalism? It's like potentially equally problematic in different ways.
So we're going to jump to online questions. I will also just say, right, we're coming up on lunch, but so it will be much easier to ask people in-person questions when we hang out after. So we're gonna go through the questions in Zoom for a little bit.
This question is for Jay from Phoenix. I love how you connected with Beyonce posted from the exhibit and wondered if you could speak to your relationship with translation of early SF tropes into Black queer space and performance?
Say that one more time so I can write this down. My brain doesn't work.
Yeah.
My brain works from 12 noon to 12:01. So yeah.
Phoenix says, I loved how you connected with the Beyonce poster from the exhibit and wondered if you could speak to your relationship with translation of early SF tropes into Black queer space and performance.
I will have to get back to you on that, Phoenix. think I need a little bit more clarity exactly what you mean. I think I will have to get back to you on that one. I'm gonna write that down.
No worries, and congrats again. That was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Phoenix.
So the next question is for Arthur from Michael. Do you think that the various depictions of deviant behavior in the 1970s and 1980s gave rise to police narratives during the same period? Examples like Ghost in the Shell, Kerberos, Panzerkopf, Mobile Police, Pat Labor, etc.
I'm just writing that down. Give me a moment. So that, of course, I can dive into this research a little bit later. Because it wouldn't surprise me to discover that they did. As a result of both during the 1970s, this shift from the modern to the postmodern includes a number of what would have been called at that time delinquent or deviant behaviors or activities. Uses of drugs, a wide range of drugs, have become a problem in the 1970s, as well as where the general delinquency and bosuzoku. And the results are that in the early 1980s, there are a large number of laws that get passed that are heavily restrictive, particularly for bosuzoku clubs. Pardon. And as a result of these new laws, the police in real life Japan, not in the dystopian manga universe, but in real life Japan, are empowered to exercise law. And they did, according to what I've read in the sociological studies conducted, even 2 or 3 people who were just friends, not even members of a bosuzoku gang. If you had 2 or 3 people who would go out riding, the police would pull them over immediately, give them a ticket for anything that they could find, if not haul them off to the police station. So as a result of these motorcycle gangs, who did cause a lot of problems, there were a number of riots and chaotic eruptions when gang members in the thousands would meet and cause major havoc. And so there was reason to be concerned. However, the change in laws allowed the police to kind of overdo it. And the results were that simply someone riding a motorcycle could be pulled over, cited for anything that they found, and even taken to prison or to jail and then released. So it would not surprise me that this would lead to depictions of heavy police narratives in future manga and anime.
Thanks. I want to circle back really quickly. Jay, did you want to follow up in Phoenix's question, or are we still in buffering on an answer?
I think I kind of hand out, or I wrote it down because I would love to have a more solid answer. But if you saw the poster, it's very reminiscent of like Maria from Metropolis. She goes even further back to the birth of Venus, which is interesting. And it's this remixing of this no, I am still buffering. See,
Totally
it's been
fine.
12 and 1.
I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions.
Yeah, I had a kind of a question for it's kind of for Lucas and Jay. I think maybe the difference between how you're using utopia is that, Lucas, you're talking about the kind of utopia that some critics call abstract utopia. And Jay, you're talking about kind of Munoz's account of there being abstract utopia on the one hand and concrete utopia on the other. And maybe you can clarify how you were each using the idea of utopia by saying a bit about whether utopia can be a concrete thing and what it means to say, yes, utopia can be a concrete thing rather than just referring to a certain kind of abstraction. Is that something that you each find like plausible or like a meaningful distinction that helps us understand why it means different things to different people?
Yeah, totally. I think what I'm trying to get at is, I don't want to say a synthesis between the two, but this kind of using the language of potentiality and partiality, the sense of like utopia is a thing that is abstract in that it can never be totally actualized, but that there are ways and moments that it is partially manifested. And so I'm not interested in sort of prescriptively defining what that looks like. But it's more about the sense of what sort of a thing is utopic, right? This like idea that utopia would not be this inherently political thing, this thing that is at its base an organization of society, right? But is a response or is a sort of an outgrowth of a moment of face-to-face encounter. So in the sense, it's like, rather than utopia as an abstract concept, it is something that is born out of like the most like tactile, physical, embodied experience, right? I don't know if that makes sense. I hope it does.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Similar to you, I think it's both. In a sense of, I do think utopia is unattainable, but I read the concert space as like a temporal blip where like a queer utopic entity is born, but again, it's a blip, so it's gonna, end eventually. I don't think it's a concrete utopia is sustainable. But I think, yeah, there are these moments where you have these blips. And I think one thing that I find interesting with Munoz is he talks about queer ephemera after this like performative act. And I think the poster is like queer ephemera of this like utopic moment, even if it is mass produced.
Yeah.
Nice. So can we get one more round of applause for